Negative freedom politically allows the people who are already fine, essentially, the billionaires, to say,
Right.
well, wait a minute, let's not have any policies that might help other people do okay because government's the enemy. And then people go along with that because they want to think, well, I'm okay. I don't need any help. I can do it all on my own, right? Which, of course, is never true. Like, to create an individual, you have to have cooperative work. And so thinking of that support as creating freedom is the thing that we have trouble with.
Wow. Okay. Welcome to the Michael Steele podcast. I'm excited about our conversation today. It's a little deep, so I want you to settle in, and it's going to make you think a little bit. That's always good. We can use that, even though, we're at the end of the year and folks want to think about parties and all that good stuff. We'll get to that. This will be a healthy start for those quiet moments. Because my guest today is Timothy Snyder. He is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Yes, that Vienna, not Vienna, Virginia, but the big Vienna. Tim took to social media in the early days of Trump's election with 20 lessons that he put out there, learned from his many years of studying European history for protecting our freedoms in the face of authoritarianism. That piece went viral. And became 2017's On Tyranny, a slim manifesto for survival and resistance that became essential reading during Trump's first term. So as we now enter a second Trump term, Tim is out with his latest book, On Freedom. It is out now. We get into what this book is all about, its impact on our thinking and understanding of what freedom really is and what it isn't. We're going to get into it with Timothy Snyder coming up right here on the Michael Steele podcast right after this. Hey folks, welcome to the Michael Steele podcast. So excited to have you in the house. When you go through an election and it's all like just intense moments and things are coming and at you and they're changing and they're beating you up and they're helping you and they're hurting you and all the stuff that goes into political campaigns, and particularly one where at the core of it is the question of who we are as a country, what we want to be as a constitutional democratic republic. And every once in a while you just need to take a break from that and sort of digest it. And it just really is exciting to welcome Timothy Snyder to the conversation so we can do a little bit of that and really kind of understand what this moment means for us as we've gotten through this campaign. And his latest book sort of, in many respects, ties together some pieces on freedom. And so, Tim, it's just a real pleasure to welcome you to the conversation about your book. It's really interesting. One of the things that was noted about it, I wanted to pull up it. They said it was Amazon's most anticipated book of the fall, and I like that. That sparks my curiosity quite a bit. But this book on freedom really gets into the human experience. And you set out to create what you would call an invitation to rediscover democracy and understand exactly what it is that we have an opportunity to do. Talk about why this book and why now, in light of everything that we know and seen. Do people really sort of get what democracy is and really appreciate the importance of it? Or is it all just the price of gas and whether or not, inflation is at X%?
Yeah. So let me start with that. Like, I don't think people are wrong to be able to want to move from place to place without it being too expensive, whether that means in cars or with gas or not. I don't think people are wrong to think that they should be able to walk out their doors and do the things that they like in their life. What I do think, where I do think we go wrong though, is by disconnecting that kind of stuff from freedom. Because what Americans end up banging themselves against the wall on is where they say, well, yeah, I'd like to go out there and I'd like for things to be affordable. I'd like to be able to do what I want to do. But then the moment you say, okay, well, we'd like to pay for good roads and good sidewalks, and we'd like to create a train so you can get to work easily, get to another city. We'd like to make sure your water is clean, your air is clean, and your kids have access to public schools. We freeze up and we think, well, wait a minute, that's a problem. That's what
Right.
we shouldn't do. That can't got to be against freedom. So, I mean, I think Americans have the right gut feeling that they should be able to go out in the world and do the things they care about. But I think we've got the wrong concept of freedom. Our notion of freedom is just like being against stuff, and this is what the book is about. It's just
Right.
like freedom just means I'm against something. I'm against the government. Maybe I'm against you. Maybe I'm against my neighbor. And that idea of freedom ultimately doesn't get you anywhere because it means that your own gut feeling, like I should be the person I want to be, runs up against your ideology, which says, oh, but I can't have any help doing that. I got to do it all on my own, which of course
Hmm.
ends up being impossible.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I love the way you framed it because it really is this idea of almost what you would call negative freedom, where you say, I want to be freed from all of these burdens over regulation and government control and da da da. So, it's this sort of this negative thing, being freed from something.
Yeah.
What you drill down on is this idea of being free to do something, free to engage, create, as you say, reason, and have these very sometimes difficult but always important conversations about how we are, how we do what we do and who we are in doing it. Our sovereignty and what was the other thing? Mobility and things like that that we seemingly have lost sight of in the freedom argument. So when you want the freedom to create better schools, the freedom to create and strengthen our sovereignty, the work that's required for that is where we start to freeze up. The things you have to do in order to achieve those freedoms and to hold on to those freedoms tend to become sort of the moment where everybody goes, "Oh, no, 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 that's not what I meant. We can't do that." What's going on there? What is it about that effort that causes people to respond the way that they do, where
Mhm.
they then begin to value something else over that work,
Mhm.
which is what I thought which is what I think happened in this last election. People found it easier to create the other in parentheses narrative, as opposed to deal with the opportunity to move the needle on things like immigration, things like healthcare, in order to achieve what they say they want.
Yeah. Yeah, let me that I you put the question so beautifully. Before I answer it, I'm just going to try to lay down a little bit more foundation on this negative positive freedom business because you've read the book, but not most folks won't have read the
Yep.
book. So the where negative freedom means just freedom from, and positive freedom means freedom to. And the relationship between them is that sure, you need to be free from terrible things. You have to be free from oppression. But the reason why you have to be free from oppression is because you're you, because you're a real person, because you might become something better, because you have values. You want to do something in the world. You want to make the world better. That's why it matters. Like the wall itself isn't the problem. The problem is the person behind the wall. And that seems like a very simple thing, but you kind of have to be like, I think you have to be confronted by sometimes by extreme experiences, personal, historical, to get that. And in my case, some of it comes from thinking about the liberation of the concentration camps, which is a word that like American soldiers, like we're supposed to think of it as liberation. And then when the doctors arrived and the nurses arrived, they said, actually, liberation isn't the word. Because no matter how great the evil is that you're removing,
Right.
still human beings there you have to care for. Like you can't just remove the evil. Like there always has to be the presence of the good. And this was driven home to me again in Ukraine, where I was visiting territories that had been, as the Ukrainians like to say, deoccupied. They sometimes avoid the word liberated for this reason. Like I was talking, this is the first scene in the book. I was talking to an older lady who was 85 at the time, and every building in her village had been destroyed. And so, and she's living in this metal shack, and she's doing her best, and she's very polite, and she's very warm and generous. But I'm thinking like she's not free until the rubble is cleared from in front of her shack. She's not even free until the buses are running and she can go get groceries, right? And so like the philosophical lesson here is that, and you need sometimes this extreme examples to see this, is that nobody is free on their own. Like you can't, even if all the bad stuff were taken away, you're still not free just being by yourself. There's always going to be something cooperative that has to happen, whether that's clearing rubble or whether that's treating people for their trauma after a horrible war. There's always going to have to be something we do together. And that's, I think, getting to your question, where Americans start to run up against a kind of inner resistance. We want to think I'm okay, right?
Right.
Like, always okay. Like I'm always right. Basically, I'm always right. And that's very comfortable for negative freedom, because negative freedom says somebody else is the problem. The government's the problem, right?
Yep.
And so then you never have to ask, who am I? What do I really care about? How am I going to make the world better? What do I want to become? Right? So negative freedom is super comfortable actually to allow you to dodge the questions of freedom. And then negative freedom politically allows the people who are already fine, essentially, the billionaires, to say, well, wait a minute, let's not have any policies that might help other people do okay, because government's the enemy. And then people go along with that because they want to think, well, I'm okay. I don't need any help. I can do it all on my own, right? Which, of course, is never true. Like to create an individual, you have to have cooperative work. And again, an extreme example makes that really clear. Like if there's a baby, you can't just say to the baby, you know what, I'm a libertarian, therefore government's not going to assist you. I'm just going to leave you here, right? And you're going to be fine, right? You're going to have from, so you're going to be cool, baby. But in fact, like the baby needs as much support as it can get. And like once you see that, you realize, well, actually that's true your whole life. You're going to be old, you're going to be sick. There's never going to be a moment where you don't need some kind of support. And so thinking of that support as creating freedom is the thing that we have trouble with.
Wow. Okay. That is a nice twist. Thinking of support as creating freedom, because I would argue a lot of people in this iteration of my Republican Party don't get that at all. That just blows right past the brain, that this idea, because this warped sense of, if you need support, if you need help, therefore that's dependence, therefore that's socialism, distorts the honest narratives around what socialism is. And most people throw those words around as if they're popcorn, and they have no clue what they mean. It's like when you ask people, well, you're against CRT, critical race theory. Tell me what it is and why you're against it. And the brains freeze because they have no clue, because they've been fed some disinformation or misinformation about what it is, that when they have to critically line it up, they can't get the pieces to line up. And so when you talk about this idea of being supported, having assistance as a form of freedom, that just does not compute.
Yeah. There's so much I love in that question. I mean, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole on critical race theory, but like one of the fact that nobody can handle critical race theory is kind of a sign that it's true.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, like that's my one comment there. But like on I want to say something about families, because I think a lot of conservative folks quite rightly think that that young people need families, and I agree. Families take different forms, and but that very young children need support is obvious, and the more the better, right? Like I'm all in favor of aunts and cousins and like grandmas and uncles and friends and all that. But the but you can't like a family needs help. Like you need to have vacation, right? Like if
Right.
dad can be home a month of a year instead of 3 days, that's going to be a better family. And if mom and dad can both have parental leave, that's going to be a better family. And that
Yeah.
child is going to grow up more free. Because to become a free person, and this is now like child development science, but to become a free person when you're really small, you need to learn, you need to have human contact, you need to learn about deferring gratification, you need to learn about naming emotions, making choices, all that good stuff. But you can only learn it from other people. And then so the government can help create conditions where other people will be around by like subsidizing childcare or creating good kindergartens and so on. But we can't do it alone. Like every time, it's like every time a child is born, we shouldn't have to reinvent the whole thing. There should always be structures there which make it easy to be a family. And if it's
Right.
easy to be a family, then everybody's more free. For me, like the child most importantly, but also the parents and everybody else is involved. But you can't do that without working together. You can't do that without taxes. And I think you can't do it honestly without seeing how that's supporting freedom rather than taking freedom away from people.
How does that fit into your definition of freedom? How then would you define freedom itself?
Yeah. So freedom for me means like so again, this is kind of a conservative point. I think that I think that virtues are real. Like I think there are good things in the world. I think integrity is as real as a rock in the field. I think
Right.
loyalty and beauty are real things. I think the world is full of virtues. But I also think that these that we all have to make choices about which ones of these things we're going to affirm in which situations, and that a free person is a person who is able to see good things, make hard choices, affirm those things, and thereby create character, right? Thereby become, so in the end, I think free will and character are the same thing. We make choices about morals over time, and we become that one unique free person that we always had the potential of being. However, to become that kind of person, we all need help. So freedom is positive because it's about positively affirming the good things. And freedom is the condition where you can become the kind of person who can do that. But for all of us, for Americans to become those kinds of people, freedom also has to be positive politically, as we've been talking
Hmm.
about, in the sense that we have to create the structures in which we can do all these things, right? And so that means, like, you use the word sovereignty, which is kind, like, it's chapter 1 is about sovereignty.
Right.
Sovereignty means becoming the kind of person who can make these choices, which nobody can do on their own. You need help. Another chapter is about unpredictability.
Hmm.
The world is predictable. We have to become unpredictable. Another chapter is about mobility. Like you have these institutions, the families, the schools, the norms in which you're raised, and then you ought to be able to rebel against them. You ought to be able to go somewhere else. You ought to be able to do something. And that's mobility. But at every stage of life, as you start as a baby and as you get to the point where you might want to leave and just do your own thing, you need some kind of support, right? And like
Right.
part of what's wrong with like the way we talk about freedom in general is that it's so inhuman. Like it's not about, it's like it's separated from the stages of life. It's separated from birth, it's separated from youth, it's separated from rebellion, it's separated from sickness, it's separated from everything. Like freedom is this abstract thing, but freedom has to attach to people, right? It only makes, like, there is no freedom out there without people. It's just people. Like the freedom only exists in us. And so then the question is, how do you morally and politically make us as free as we can be?
So the other, just to continue, because you touched on in your response there, those aspects that help us determine what it is to be truly free. You mentioned sovereignty and unpredictability, mobility, but you also have two others: factuality and solidarity. What are those two pieces, and how do they fit into the other three?
Okay. So now, Michael, we're getting to the point where we've kind of put the book together. So like at the beginning, I talk about what freedom is, in general, which we've talked about. And at the end, I have policy recommendations. And then these 5 things that we've mentioned now: the sovereignty, the unpredictability, the mobility, factuality, solidarity. These are what I call the forms of freedom. So these are the ways we have to live together so that we can become individuals. And they're based on insights from contemporary science, as
Hmm.
well as philosophy and sometimes my own experience. Factuality and solidarity are the two that are like looking back. They're true of all stages of life. Sovereignty is about the beginning. Unpredictability is about growing up. Mobility is a little bit about rebelling, becoming your own person, the American dream. Factuality and solidarity are things that you need all the time. So Factuality is so important because we have to have our own story, and our if we're living inside a big lie, we can't be free. We're living inside somebody else's story. Like, it's as simple as that. If you're a pawn and you don't even know it's a chess game,
Mm-hmm.
you're not free, right? If you're living according to rules that somebody else understands and you don't, you're not a free person. Or to put it defensively, like, if you want to rebel, and we're living in a world where, like, there are people who are more wealthy and powerful than we are. What can you do? Well, you can say something that's true. You can say, oh, this person is much wealthier than I am, and they're corrupt. And if that's true, then maybe you've got some leverage, right?
Right.
But if you can't get to those facts, because there are no journalists reporting, just to stay on this example, journalists reporting on wealth inequality, or worse, if everybody says, well, there's no such thing as truth, it's just opinion, right? Like, if there's no truth, then like, it's not true that Elon Musk has $100 billion and that Putin has 200 billion, or whatever it is, right? If there's no truth, what does that matter, right? It doesn't. And so you need the facts, and this is like something that people have understood since the ancient Greeks. Like, you have to have facts as a last resort, because if you don't have facts, then the terrain becomes completely slippery, and the wealthy and the powerful just push you around. Solidarity is like sort of both logical and human. If I'm going to be free, you have to be free too. That's like, so like, if I say freedom is just for me, then that's not freedom. In fact, it won't work. In practice, it won't work. Or if I say freedom is just for my group and not for your group, that's not going to turn out to be freedom. Like, it may turn out to be privilege or something else, but it's not going, practically, it's not going to turn out to be freedom. And morally, it can't work. Morally, it can't work. Freedom has to begin with the acknowledgement that you and I are equal, right? That we have equal dignity. But more than that, that freedom begins from, and this is where I really diverge from the way it's usually talked about in our tradition anyway. Freedom begins from me accepting that I can always learn something from you. So the way that we usually think about freedom is like, I'm off on a mountain, like, I not only, like, I see the world objectively, I know my own interests, but I don't see the world objectively, and I don't see my own interests unless you help me out, right? Because we all go through the world with, like, metaphysical shaving cream on our faces, right? There are always things that we don't know about ourselves, but and if we don't listen to other people, we don't ever learn it, right? And if we don't ever learn it, then we can't actually become free, because there are basic things we don't even get about ourselves, right? So freedom actually starts from empathy. Like, it has to include empathy. It has to include the ability to, like, recognize the other person as human and learn from them about yourself.
I love it. And that sets up for me and for my podcast family here. The next part of the conversation I want to have with you is the application of this, how some of this we see playing out in today's environment. When you talk about places like Ukraine and Gaza, when you talk about the impact of social media on how we communicate and how we look at each other. And I really want to get into a statement that you wrote, in which you noted freedom is not just an absence of evil, but a presence of good. And really get into that, because as a former seminarian, that sounded so theological to me that I was okay. Let's pin that one, because I want to get into that conversation. Folks, we're going to take a quick break so y'all can regroup now that you've got the foundation of our conversation under your belt. You get a chance to go and grab a little something extra to put in that coffee mug, because we're about to get into some real groovy stuff with my buddy Timothy Snyder, who's written a fascinating book on freedom. We are dissecting it now, and we're going to come back with a whole lot more with Tim right after this. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Michael Steele podcast. We are having great conversation with Timothy Snyder. He is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University. Dear friend of mine, Tim, Matthew Dolan is a graduate of Yale undergrad and Yale Law, and I give him grief about being a Yalie all the time. As a Johns Hopkins guy, even though I'm wearing Lafayette, because my good friends at Lafayette had me at the university to speak recently. So shout out to Lafayette. But it's great to have you on to talk about your new book on freedom. We were getting into some of the foundational ideas and arguments that you were making in the book, which I think is really profoundly important. I tell you, just as a quick before we go any further, what really I find so disturbing is how we've become so intellectually uncurious about ourselves, Tim. How we are just so profoundly ignorant, and you to the point where you can't even say that people are being ignorant. And so, if you're being ignorant, you're being ignorant. Let's just call it out. When we get to a point where I can't look as stupid and say, that's really stupid. Just to dumb down what's happening in our culture, in our economy, in our politics, in our society as a whole. It's got to be profoundly frustrating for someone like yourself, who is a thinker. You are a man of letters. You are one of these individuals that write about and expound on the human condition in a way to inform and educate and enlighten, but also to help us move to that better spot. That's what this book is. It's like a little roadmap with guiding lights and little flags. Don't go there. You want to go here. What is it about us now that we find this conversation so much more difficult to have, where we are just honestly assessing our intellectual capacity to understand and inform ourselves, to know facts, right? To see facts for what they are, define truth, and not fall into the trap, well, it's all just opinion.
Yeah. So I'm going to try to answer that, also looping back to what you were talking about before the break, where you were asking me about the presence of good. Because I think it's all connected to that. So facts themselves don't exist unless we value truth, right? And valuing truth is a moral commitment. I mean, I can give you a million facts, but it doesn't mean that you have to care about them. You have to decide. There are things that are true and false about the world, right? So I think there's a connection between the factuality and the metaphysics, and that's one of the things that's happened. That's been broken. And this
I don't want to distract you off your point, but is that sort of the Galileo principle where he was stating a fact about the rotation of the sun and the stars and the moon, and there was not that moral commitment to understanding that fact, and everybody kind of went, no, the earth, everything rotates around the earth. There's not this sun thing. I mean, is that kind of where we are, where you're talking about there, or am I off base?
Well, we're definitely getting back to the point where people think this, that the sun will around the earth. I mean, that's like, it's a fact.
Yes, we are.
And like, that's going on right now. But yeah, I mean, you're catching something, which is the truth. Like, truth seeking requires courage. Whether you're a scientist working against what everybody else thinks and you're doing some daring experiment, or whether you're an investigative reporter who's like going after corruption or whatever, there's always like a little bit of courage to it. Like, facts are not dry. Facts are human. They don't emerge automatically from some mechanical process. They only exist because humans care about things. This is where I wanted to go with this. What doesn't have a presence of good is the machine, right? So just to be clear, like, I'm on the side of the humans. I'm pro-human. I like humans. I'm on their side. Yeah, like whatever is coming for us, But right now, what's coming for us is the machine, like in the sense of social media, the algorithms, right? And whatever else the machine has, it does not have a sense of what's good. It just doesn't. There's no morality there. And I think I'm trying to give you an answer to the scale of your question. I think we're becoming more like the machine, or we're starting to think that we should be like the machine. And what is the machine like? Well, it has an answer to everything. It's a predictable answer. It's the answer
Right.
that kind of feels right at the moment, you know? And then the machine trains us to be, and this is how the machine is like a negative freedom reproducer. The machine trains us to be like, you're right, you're right, you're right, you're right. Oh, and look at these other people who are not only wrong, but they're outrageous. You know, they're malicious, they're hateful, right? And so then you end up with these conversations online, which are all like, it's all there's no world in it. Like it's so thin of actual, like, all the stuff that you were talking about. It's so thin in terms of humanity and in terms of factuality, but it's very thick with insults and bullying and like clever
Right.
phrase to make other people feel bad. So I think like we're becoming like the machines that we've created, and those machines are fast. They're quick. They're quicker than we are, and they're very quickly making us stupid, because the things that we have that they don't have are all these funny, intuitive, human, empathetic ways of understanding things, which we're being trained out of.
Right.
Trained out of that stuff, and that leaves us, not only ignorant, as you say, but also I would add unwise, like incapable of judging things in the right way. They leave us slaves to our habits and our impulses, which is not the same thing as being free, right? And this is again how it hooks up to negative freedom, because if you believe in negative freedom, then you think, well, I felt like doing it, therefore I was free. But
Yes.
the machine will make you feel like doing stuff. It'll make you feel like writing an angry response. It'll make you feel like buying something. But the fact that you feel like doing something doesn't mean you're free. You're free if you have like the human ability to judge what's good, and then to really having evaluated stuff, to work those preferences, those values, those virtues out into the world. So that's how I think it all hangs together.
So have we become the slave to the algorithm, or are we becoming the slave to the algorithm?
That's the irony, right? Like we're becoming, like it's why it's the worst. I mean, okay, I don't want to. That's pretty dramatic. There's pretty horrible forms of human servitude, but there is something particularly awful in becoming the servant to something that doesn't care, right? Like,
Oof.
like
Oh,
right?
yeah.
There's not even anybody there caring about your oppression, at the end of
Right.
the day, right? Like Twitter doesn't care that you're a slave to its algorithm. TikTok doesn't care. There's thinking being done, but there's no thinker. There's not a consciousness that's oppressing you. You're just oppressing yourself with the help of these algorithms.
So does that mean that the human behind the algorithm, right, who's writing the algorithms, or at least positioning them, where does their caring step in? Because what you just said is absolutely true. The algorithm doesn't care. It's going to do what it's going to do. But someone, human, put that algorithm in front of you, put that algorithm in place. Is it one of those things where they just do it and step away, or is it always this continual personal manipulation as well?
Yeah, I love that question, and I appreciate your pulling me back from my extreme man versus machine thing. Because
I got your back, brother. I got your back.
Because you're totally right. I think like the way that the authors of the algorithms or the owners of the platforms want us to see it is that, hey, look, we're all objective human beings. We're all just following our interests. Like, you're completely mature. If you doom scroll for 18 hours in a row, and lose your family or whatever, that's because you're objectively doing the things which was objectively right for you because you felt like it.
Right.
So this is all like that, and this is why many of them, I think, not all of them, there are some righteous folks, but it's why many of them are extreme advocates of negative freedom, because they want you to think, oh yeah, you're already fine, right? And the fact that you're addicted to our products just proves that you're a free person. Whereas in terms of positive freedom, you'd be asking, what structures educate people so that we can have human interactions and become richer human beings, right? Think about this in terms of pedagogy. And as pedagogy, and as you rightly say, as human design pedagogy, this is terrible. It generally makes us, I mean, there are exceptions, like there are people who know how to use this stuff. There are good things you can do and all that.
Sure.
But it's designed.
It's designed and weighted that, right, in the negative way.
To isolate you, to isolate you, to make you a servant of a slave, really, to your own impulses, right? That's what it's designed to do. And so as pedagogy, but if so long as you believe only in negative freedom, you can't make these arguments. If you believe in positive freedom, like if you start with the humans, then you end up caring about the design. Or to put this like, to put it in a different way, if you think about freedom as being something which is just out there, right, then it's hard to argue against this stuff. But if you think freedom is all about the people, like I'm going to start with the baby, what do I want to put in front of a baby? Then the answer is not going to be screens. You know, if you think about it that way, like all we care about is the baby growing up. That's all we care about. Then when we say freedom of speech, we don't care about whether, you know, Elon Musk gets to project to 5 billion people or 4 billion people, right? That's not freedom of speech. That's just, you know, digital utterances.
Right.
Freedom of speech is a child learning about the world and having enough factual information to make good judgments and having enough moral input to come up with his own moral world. Like that's freedom of speech. Like that's the thing you have to cultivate. And so when you start with negative freedom and you live in this machine world, you end up with freedom of speech just entirely being about, are the billionaires getting to manipulate us exactly the way they want, as opposed to, are we raising free speakers who are engaged with the world, right, and enrich the world with their judgments, which is what freedom of speech is always supposed to be about.
Damn, you have just given an enlightenment level understanding of freedom. You have taken it, I think, to a place that the founders, some of whom probably understood more than others, but in articulation, put it in very pragmatic terms: freedom of the press, freedom of religion, right? But you've sort of connected a bigger dot to all of that for us to understand exactly at the core of it what the word means. And I think that's often a lot of times lost in translation. People don't understand really what the word means and how it applies across a lot of things. So when you're looking at positive freedom, for example, that has the ability to change the way AI and social media and other things play out.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly right. Because what we're in danger of doing is we're saying like AI for the purpose of AI, you know, like AI, like we should care about it, like just for its kind of its own sake, and it makes things easier for us, and therefore we can like live with impulse. But it actually makes us much harder to become our own person. I mean, one of the basic principles of AI, so-called, I'm going to say for in a moment why I don't think it should be called that, but it is that it predicts the next thing, right? That's like one of the basic ways that it works. Like it predicts what the next word is going to be, right? And so in that, like, and so what it brings together is the most predictable possible combination of things when you ask it about something. And it's not judging that on the basis of anything human. And as a result, like it's sort of scraping together the most predictable parts of us. And as we consume it, it makes us more predictable. And like, we too anecdotal, but like I see this, like I was just doing a science project with my son last night, and we were trying to understand something, which was electroluminescence from LEDs. And like to understand it, you got to actually know what the words mean, right? But if you ask AI, like it comes up with like some stuff that kind of looks like English, but it has no sense of which words are more important. Like what's the root of it really? Like where do you have to start? You know, all these things that humans should be able to get. And so then you get kids who, you know, turn in papers that are basically like, that sound like AI. And sometimes you know they're AI, but sometimes you worry that it's something worse than that, which is that their brain has become like AI, and they're just like jumbling, like their brains are just jumbling these bits of text, and like they're cutting and pasting, but they don't actually get the thing, which like there is a thing which they don't get. So yeah, and the reason why I don't think AI should be called AI is that you know that I think that every time we ask AI a question, the answer should be hey, look, just between you and me, buddy, what we're doing is we're warming the atmosphere here, and like that should be the answer, and they should be like, neither one of us is going to survive this, right? You get
Right.
like that should
Right.
be the answer, and until that's the answer to all of our questions, I don't think it's AI.
One of the interesting things about On Freedom, your book, and again, folks, I highly recommend the book, just to settle in and contextualize. Since you throw these big words around, contextualize what they really mean to you and what they mean to the community. You wrote this book, as I understand, while you were in Ukraine, and how was being there impact the writing of this book, because you're in an environment in where a lot of what you are writing about, when you're talking about the forms of freedom from sovereignty to solidarity, you're watching the deconstruction, if not the destruction, of a lot of that. At least the attempt to do that by an aggressive power. How did that space-time experience inform your writing here?
So I had this idea in general that, and it goes back to your question about solidarity and what I was trying to say about empathy. I had this feeling in general that a book about freedom has to be personal, but also interpersonal.
Mm-hmm.
So like there were places where I feel like I had to rely on my own experience as an American, but at the same time, I thought I'm only going to be consistent with my own approach here if I listen to other people's experiences of being American. And this is not what you asked about directly, but it's relevant, which is why I also taught the book a couple semesters in a maximum security prison, because I needed other people's stories, and then that was really helpful enough for 100 reasons, but that was one of them. And with Ukraine, that was also a kind of test, right? Like I got out of America and into a country where people were talking about freedom as much as we do, or more, but they generally meant what I'm calling positive freedom, was my experience. Mm-hmm. And the dramatic example would be Russian occupation, kind of what I said at the beginning, where the Ukrainians sometimes make fun of Russians for using the word liberation. There's a Russian word, osvobojenie, which the Russians use all the time, but they often mean it in the sense of we completely destroyed the city and we killed everybody and now it's liberated. And so like that notion of liberation is something Ukrainians sometimes mock. And they have this word deoccupation, which is kind of humble and interesting, because it suggests that removing the evil is necessary, but it's not the same thing as bringing back the good, which is so important, right? It's so essential. But then beyond that, there's the future part where, I think freedom is about the future. Like, I don't think we have to know the past, but we have to know the past so we can see the plausible lines that might lead into the future. One of the ways people keep us unfree is cutting us off from the past so we don't see those lines that could lead to a better place. But freedom is fundamentally about, following those lines into a better future. Mm-hmm. And when the Ukrainians talk about the Russians, and like what they say is something like they cut us off from this better future we were getting to. And that for me is so important, right? Like to be a free person individually, or to have a land of the free, there has to be a future that you see yourself moving into. And they in these horrible conditions, they helped me with that. But then there was also the question of character, which Zelensky helped me with. And not him alone, but he and I had a very explicit conversation about this in September of 2022, where like I was asking him the kind of banal question of why he didn't leave Kiev, as everybody thought he was going to do in February of that year. And he said something along these lines. It gave a really long answer, which was about his parents and about growing up. But the gist of it was that you go through life, you make moral choices. Those moral choices make you the person who you are. And then that person who you are sometimes can only do one thing. And that's paradoxical, because we want to say, well, freedom means you can do anything.
All right.
But the truth be told, like, if freedom means you can do anything, then that means you're always going to run, right? You're always going to run, and you're going to say, well, I'm a free person.
Right.
Whereas if you think freedom is positive morally, like if you think freedom is about the accumulation of moral choices, then sometimes, you get to a point where actually there is only one thing you feel like you can do.
I was going to say, exactly that. I was going to say freedom sometimes requires that you do just one thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Ukrainians really helped me with that. And I mean, and it was a little distressing for me as an American, incidentally, because at that moment, what did it say about us that we assumed they were going to run away?
Right.
That was the worrying part. Like that we couldn't like when it actually came to a fight for freedom, what did it say about us that we assumed that they were going to run away?
Well, and that it raises a very interesting question, because you had recently Senator Mike Rounds express frustrations that the United States hadn't given Ukraine enough support and the weapons that it needed to win the war. And he said, as much as I would like to believe we can negotiate with a tyrant, I suspect we may be deceiving ourselves. I want to play that clip because I think it's interesting in the context of what we've been saying about freedom. Let's take a listen.
But folks, it's time to take a hard look at this thing and really ask ourselves, do you believe that this tyrant, if you offer him a part of a free country, do you think he's going to stop?
No.
Or do you think he's going to have to go back home and say, you see, when we stand strong, the weak, the West, these people who are decadent, do you think for 1 second he's going to turn around and walk back in and say, but we most certainly have our freedom now, that we've been defended by this and that we have everything we need? Or do you think he's going to look at that and say, you see, we're strength, we're Russian strength?
I think in many ways that really kind of what this in the context of what we see happening in Eastern Europe with Ukraine, what we also see happening in the Middle East and Gaza. That freedom thread is a central part of the conversation, and where both the aggressor and those who are being oppressed are battling over what their perceptions, their concept of freedom is.
Yeah. I'm going to wait and let you ask me a question specifically about Gaza, because there's something here about Russia which is really important.
Sure.
I've been thinking about this Ukrainian-Russian relationship for a long time. I'm a historian of this part of the world. I used to go to Russia. Now I can't. I still go to Ukraine all the time. And for the last 10 years or so, I've been thinking, it's really struck me about what the difference is between these two places. Everyone wants to say, well, they speak the same language, they share the same culture, whatever. We speak the same language as a lot of people. It doesn't mean that we're the same country as they are.
Right.
We have a common history with a lot of other countries that came out of the British Empire. It doesn't mean that we're New Zealand. But what was interesting is how, something much deeper than language or even high culture, what was interesting was precisely the different understanding of freedom, where the Ukrainians had kind of worked themselves towards this notion that freedom is about the future. It's about a messy struggle of people with different values to create a space where they could realize those values. It was acted out in 2004, 2005, acted out again in 2013, 2014, acted out now in the resistance to Russia. Whereas in Russia, and again, it's not about the ethnicity or the language, it's not even so much about the history, but it's about a different political solution. Whereas in Russia, you have one person who's in charge, and he's extraordinarily wealthy, and he controls the media. And his notion of freedom is what I'm calling negative. It's all about an us and them. We're free insofar as we destroy the West. We're free insofar as we remove Ukraine from the map. And there's nothing positive there, right? There's literally no idea of Russia. You have to, you can try as hard as you want, but you cannot carve out a positive image of Russia from anything that Putin says.
Interesting.
Or anything people around him say. It's all about, it's the West's fault. It's Ukraine's fault. If Ukraine would cease to exist, it's then Russia would exist. Then it would suddenly figure out who it is. Russia's become an anti-Ukraine.
Right.
And the meaning of going and dying, on that scale of hundreds of thousands for Ukraine, is in a sense that there isn't that Russians don't know what they are, right? It's because that's the, I don't want to say the lowest point, but one of the lowest points that negative freedom can take you towards. And so, of course, I agree with that analysis, because the people who run Russia aren't thinking about the interests of the Russian people or anything.
No,
right. It's all in us and them. And if they were, God forbid, to subjugate Ukraine, they would use the resources, the technology, the territory, and sadly also the humans to repeat this in some other place in some time in the not too distant future.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So what about Gaza then? How does this freedom uh notion, what does it look like in a place like Gaza, and in given the turmoil and consternation around creating a two-state solution, and the Israeli view that they want to terraform this land. What's your thought there?
So I'm gonna answer your question directly, but I want to like take, if I can, I just want to go way back
Go, yeah.
and gesture at the historical argument of the book. So the historical argument of the book is about how negative freedom has worked in an imperial world. So like in an imperial world, I want to take some territory, and I want to enslave some people. I want to do that. And and the reason this is negative freedom is because the only thing that can stop me from doing that is the government, right? Like
Right.
some centralized, just government. And that's a part of American history. Like the reason why it goes back to a question I didn't completely answer of yours, like why people think this. Part of the reason people think this is the history of slavery. Like that if I have slaves, and also if I have women looking after me, my definition of freedom can be, I've got the slaves and I've got the women looking after me.
Sure.
And that is a lot of how a lot of Americans for a long time define freedom. And that's I mean, moral questions aside, that's part of an imperial world. Like that's a notion of freedom that works in the imperial world. And for me, the big political question of the 21st century is, how do you get past an imperial world where you're defining freedom in terms of taking land, subjugating people, not treating them as fully human, right?
Right.
And turning them towards your own interests. And I don't see any way out of that except by way of starting with states and then thinking about how states, then talking about, I don't think you can do it without states. And part of my research as a historian has been about ethnic cleansing and genocide and other politics of atrocity, where it turns out that it's not exactly that the state is just oppressing people. It's very often that you have some kind of blurry situation where a border is not clear, or
Right.
where a state doesn't recognize another state, or where a state doesn't recognize that other people have the right to another state, or where a state destroys the state of some other people. And so now I'm getting towards Gaza, right? So you can't, like, freedom doesn't begin with Palestinians having negative freedom, right? Like you can't say, oh, look, the Palestinians are free because they don't have a state. That's
Right.
absurd, right? Like that shows you the absurdity of the whole position. You have to start from, okay, they see themselves as a people, and even the Israelis, when they're not minding, what they say, generally see them as a people. They should have a state, and then from that state, you work forwards to creating conditions where they can be free. But you can't do it. You can't do it without a state. And of course, this applies to Israel too. Like if Israel is going to be a country where there's going to be freedom in the sense we're talking about, it can't also be an empire, right? Like on whatever scale. If you're colonizing other people, you're treating them as means to an end, then you yourself are not going to end up being a free country in the senses we've been talking about.
And you would think that given its history, its 5,000 plus year history, that point would be better understood, but it has fallen. Is it the leadership is moving it towards this imperialistic view of itself, in that it is doing to Gaza what others have done and tried to do to Israel? Or, I mean, because that's one of the arguments one of the places I fall down on now, with a lot of my Christian brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
I put it this way, Timothy. I say that today's Christians have become like those who once sat in the Roman Colosseum.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the men and women who sat in the Colosseum watched the persecution and enjoyed the persecution and condoned the persecution of others and rationalized that persecution in various ways, through entertainment, through cleansing, through whatever, otherism back in the day. And to hear that play out today with a lot of sort of Christo nationalist types, who want everybody to read the Trump Bible and to profess the Trump Bible because they stuck the Constitution in it to justify it, to curtail and remove the rights of women to decide their bodily health, and at the same time to declare we want you to be as productive in producing children as we decide you to be, and they wrap this in this sort of crystal ball of religious rightism. That to me is very similar in the sense of that negative freedom. You will be more free when I control your body. You will be more free when I set forth the fullest expression of who you are. You don't get to do that.
Man, there's so much wonderful stuff in there, and unless I forget, I just want to like the Colosseum perspective. I mean, those are tough words, and I think it captures something that's very important. So I'm glad to hear you're having those conversations. Let me try to work my way back to Israel and start with where you left off. I mean, Jesus washed the feet of Mary Magdalene?
Right?
That's where you got to start. Like, look at how the man actually treated women. And in that act, there's an acknowledgement of as I see it, other people can read scripture differently, but as I see it, there's an acknowledgement of the body of the other person, which is where I think it all starts. Like, I think we can't be free unless we see other people as being human like us, but also unless we can recognize that some bodies are, for social reasons or biological reasons or both together, are different, and recognize what that difference means, which means that a white man has to have some idea what it's like for a black man to walk into a bus. And it means that a man has to have some sense of what it's like for a woman to live her life in fear of rape. Like, not a complete sense, you can't get there, but just like washing the feet, you just like a gesture, a gesture in the right direction.
Yep.
If we don't understand other people's predicaments, then we're not understanding our own position either, right? And if you don't understand your own position, you can't be a free person. Next thing I wanted to say about Jesus, and this is something I work with a lot in the book, is what he regarded the most important law as being. He said, along with love God above all else, is love thy neighbor as thyself.
That's it.
And the story that he tells about loving thy neighbor as thyself is precisely about the other, right? It's not about a Jew helping a Jew. It's about a Samaritan helping a Jew. And the whole point of the story is that Samaritans and Jews don't get along. That's the whole point of the story. And then he asks at the end, who is thy neighbor? And the disciples are forced to say, he that showed mercy. And then Jesus says, go and do likewise. And that's the point, right? Like, that seems to me like, if you're going to be a Christian and you're going to listen to what Jesus himself says is the highest law, you've got to listen to that parable. That's a demanding parable, because it demands that you not only love your neighbor as yourself, but you recognize your neighbor as every other human being who has the possibility of doing good and showing mercy, and that you therefore need to show mercy. And the way that a lot of Christians are looking at Gaza, I mean, a lot of people call themselves Christians looking at Gaza, does not show that. Right?
No.
It shows the opposite. It shows not treating other people as being like oneself, not showing mercy, valuing mercilessness for some other reason. And then finally getting to the Israelis and the 5,000 years of history. I mean, what people are capable of learning from the past, man. Like, you can learn anything you want from the past.
True.
And from the Holocaust, from the Holocaust, you can go two different fundamental ways. One way is to say nothing like this should ever happen again to anybody, and another was to say nothing like this should ever happen to us. And those lead you to two
very different outcomes,
conclusions, right?
Yep.
But in my view, I think I have the radical view that Jews are human beings, and that they fall prey to the same kinds of temptations and make the same kinds of mistakes as everybody else. And responding to your question about today's state of Israel, I think their prime minister is in a very typical third decade of the 21st century situation, where he's committed a bunch of crimes. He doesn't want to go to prison. Therefore, he wants to wreck the country's justice system, and he's happy to have the distraction of a foreign war and for all that to go on as long as possible. And that's a very human situation. There's nothing specifically Jewish about that. There's nothing special about it. And it makes me a little sad when we seek to apply like all these grand concepts to what is in fact, in my view, a very banal and actually tawdry political situation, tawdry from the point of view of Israel and obviously tragic from the point of view of the people who are dying because of Israeli policy.
Professor Timothy Snyder, you have made my day here in this conversation, my friend. I've thoroughly enjoyed in your insights and sort of peeling back all of the concepts, good and bad, understood and misunderstood, that we have around freedom. And the book on freedom really sort of tests the limits of what we think we know and presses us to really kind of understand ourselves in this context of freedom. And the illustration you just gave at the end there really brings it home, because at the core of it, sometimes we just behave as bad people for very selfish reasons. and don't get it twisted and mixed up in all these other things and hide behind someone else's freedom. And because that's oftentimes what this turns out to being. I thank you, sir, for bringing On Freedom onto this platform for a conversation. I encourage all of you out there to go out there and get a copy and settle in for a very important read that's gonna challenge your thinking. It's gonna challenge the way you see and understand this great experiment that we have, and the role that you play in it, and the role that we allow others to play in elected leadership, and how they view this country and the impact it may ultimately have on our freedom. Timothy Snyder, thank you, sir.
Michael, thank you so much. This has been wonderful for me.
Go ahead.
I got a former seminarian to say damn on his own show. So
I know. Oh, baby, you should tune in. So some of the best cuss words I learned while I was in a monastery. So it's all good, my friend. Thank you very much. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to visit with Timothy and myself. Follow Tim on Twitter, X, at Timothy D. Snyder. Follow a lot of his thinking and writing there. Grab yourself a copy of On Freedom. It is out now on Amazon or wherever you get your books. And remember, what we do here is have great conversations with very smart people and bringing us some hopefully important insights about ourselves and our country. I hope you got some of that today. Share this with a friend on whatever platform you get your podcast. Certainly give us a review on Apple Podcasts. Give this particular conversation a review. I'll be very curious to see what you thought about what the good professor brought to us today. This podcast, of course, is part of the Bulwark network. So glad you can be a part of it. Follow us on social media at Bulwark Online. Until next time, be safe, be well. We got a lot going on in transition, which we're going to peel through over the next few weeks and months leading up to the inauguration. But we're entering the holiday season, folks. I want everyone to have a great Thanksgiving coming up in a few days. And if you're listening to this podcast after Thanksgiving, I hope you have a belly full of turkey to make you feel all yummy inside. Until next time, be safe and be well.